All right, good afternoon, Team Ivy. Welcome to the July Diversity Series on Words Matter, reflecting a true sense of belonging with our communication. This weekly Lunch and Learn series will be scheduled on each Tuesday within the month of July. We just have one more next week to build understanding of the different experiences of our students, our employees, in our communities, and offer ways to build a better sense of belonging at Ivy Tech Community College. A basic understanding of disability etiquette can help make students, employees, and community members feel more comfortable when interacting with colleagues with disabilities and can help prevent awkward situations. Disability etiquette refers to respectful communication and interaction with people who have disabilities. Today, I am going to lead a discussion on, well, what are disabilities, including the legal definitions, and we'll also dig into the social construct of disabilities. Then we will go to the panel and ask specific questions on how we can learn more about disabilities, what are effective language words that we can use, and how can we assist our students with disabilities. I'll first have the panelists introduce themselves, including their roles at Ivy Tech and which campuses they are at. So I'll start with Jamie.
Hi everyone, my name is Jamie Fry. I'm the Director of Disability Support Services on the Terre Haute campus, and I've been with Ivy Tech for about 19 years and in the Disability Services role for about 17.
Awesome. And Pat.
Good morning, I'm Pat Toombs. I work at the Anderson campus, and I've been involved with disability services here for about 18 years.
Awesome. All right. So quick housekeeping. You are all on mute for the duration of the session. If you have a question for our speakers, please type that in the chat and I will attempt to get to as many as I can during the session. I'll be monitoring the chat, so do not wait until the end for your questions, please. Also, this webinar is being recorded and will be posted on our diversity website at www.ivytech.edu/diversity. And our YouTube channel, Ivy Tech Community College, if you look that up on YouTube for additional viewing. All right, so as we begin, I wanted to just take some time to talk about disabilities in general. The National Organization on Disabilities, otherwise known as NOD or NOD, estimates that there are nearly 57 million Americans with disabilities. People are often the most uncomfortable when it comes to referring to a person's disability. What do I say? The first thing to remember is to put the person first. So let's first start with the definition of disability. This year, we celebrate 30 years since the passing of the American with Disability Act of 1990. Under Title II of the ADA, disability is defined in three parts. First, a physical or mental impairment that substantially limits one or more major life activities of such individual. 2, a record of having such an impairment, or 3, being regarded as having such an impairment. So what are some examples of physical or mental impairments? It can include, but not limited to, deafness, blindness, cancer, ADA, asthma, irritable bowel syndrome, major depression, diabetes, endometriosis, HIV. Those are totally different things. Some of them are physically present, right? Many of them are invisible that you can't see, but they're all examples of physical or mental impairments. And a part of that definition was a physical or mental impairment that substantially limits one or more major life activities. So what is a major life activity? So that would include, but not limited to, eating, breathing, sleeping, thinking, walking, standing, sitting, writing, working, interacting with others. Those are all major life activities. So if there is something that substantially limits one of those major life activities, whether it's a physical or mental impairment, then that is the definition of a disability. This is the stark black and white kind of legal way that we look at disabilities as a medical issue. However, when we think of how society has created or at least contributes to the social construct of disabilities, then we can gain a different perspective. For example, many individuals who are deaf do not view the inability to hear as a disability. While this doesn't apply to all, and is certainly a generalization. Many in the deaf community see sign language as nothing more than just an alternative form of communication. It's society's reliance on sounds and the lack of inclusion that puts them at a disadvantage in certain situations. Examples of exclusion of people with disabilities are abundant. Although the politically correct way to speak about this population is known as people first language that I spoke about earlier, saying a person with a disability and not a disabled person, there is another argument to that. The position is that they are disabled, not because of the diagnosis, but because society disables them by not making the environment accessible. So for example, a person who uses a wheelchair goes to a local festival and can only travel down 30% of the paths due to the lack of accessibility. They have difficulty locating accessible restrooms, etc. Looking through this lens, we can begin to see how with the right changes, people with disabilities, or disabled people as some would be preferred, they can be included. So the more inclusive we are as a society, the more we show that we value everyone and the more that people can fully participate, and it's beneficial for everyone. This is in essence the goal of, this is the essence of Goal 8 within Ivy Tech strategic plan. When we think about eliminating systemic inequities for our students, when we think about leveraging our leadership for positive change, when we think about creating a place where everyone belongs, we have to be inclusive in our language. And I hope that these series have been helpful in that regard. No one's perfect. We all get it wrong at some times. So just coming to these sessions and learning more, that's the best thing that we can really do to ensure that we're moving in the right direction at Ivy Tech. All right, so we will dig into the questions. I will start with Pat. So if I'm working with a person with a disability and I'm uncomfortable, is there language to use and not to use, and how do I know what to say?
I think that's a great place to begin because there is a level of discomfort. In fact, I mentioned I work with students with disabilities for 18 years, and you know what? Sometimes I'm uncomfortable too. In fact, as I was reflecting over this past week, I was thinking about how I was taught to interact with people with disabilities. Think about it when you were a child and maybe you saw someone in a wheelchair. What did your parents tell you? Don't stare, right? And so you learn to look away. Well, just think about for a minute, think about what that taught us to be uncomfortable around people with disabilities, and then think of the message that that sent to the person with a disability. I don't see you, you're invisible. Wow, how powerful that is. And so that's why language is really a powerful tool. And we want to make sure that we're using it in a way that is for good. So I find it helpful to have general guidelines instead of a bunch of rules. And then that way it helps me as I'm interacting, well, with all people. It helps me be able to make decisions maybe on the fly. So what would be some general guidelines that we could apply here? Well, you've already mentioned, Denisha, is the people first language. So really the first rule I think of is respect, show respect. So if we think about people with disabilities, we want to use people first language because they're a person. They're a person with a disability, but they're a person. It's a unique individual. And so, and the disability is probably not the most significant part of who they are either. So people first language is great. We want to concentrate on the person, not the disability. So for example, we might say a person who has epilepsy, not the epileptic. Or we might say that he has bipolar disorder. He's not bipolar. He is not the disability. And then by the same token, we would also want to say the person without a disability rather than saying normal. I mean, think of the message then that you're sending if you're calling someone normal because they don't have a disability. Words have power. So the first general guideline I would say is make sure we're showing respect. It's more than being politically correct. And so you think about, well, why would it matter if I say the word handicapped as opposed to disability? Why does that word matter? Well, handicapped has an image, in fact, it has a heritage of being a person on a street corner with a cap in hand begging. So you could see where that would be offensive. And so that's why we use the word disability rather than the word handicap. So then you would probably want to say accessible parking rather than handicap parking. Do we have handicap stickers that you put in your window? Yeah. Is it going to take a while for us to change language? Yeah. Will that word matter to everybody? No, probably not. So that is going to lead me to the second guideline. First one being show respect. The second one is just pay attention. Take your cues from the other person. And so you mentioned already, Denisha, about people in the deaf community. Many times they do not want to refer to themselves as having a disability, and they take great pride in being deaf. So they want to be referred to as a deaf person, not a person with deafness. And so you want to pay attention, take your cue from that person. It's okay to even ask questions of, what their preferences are, because we don't want to lump all people with a certain disability into the same category. Everybody has their own personal preferences. So show respect in your language and pay attention, take your cues from that person. We also want to avoid negative words. So we wouldn't want to say words such as lame or cripple or victim, or think about wheelchair bound or confined to a wheelchair. Wow, what connotation does that send? So we wouldn't want to use those kinds of words. So show respect with your words. What would be respectful? Person first, and then take your cues from the other person. And if the disability isn't relevant at all, don't mention it. It might have nothing to do with a conversation. So if you're meeting someone who's blind, they're probably not really going to want to have a conversation with you about your blind cousin. That's not the sum total of their life. Just make sure if that's not relevant to the conversation, don't bring it up. There's no need. Now, there's no need, though, to be anxious. Just relax. If, for example, you say the word gotta run to someone who uses a wheelchair, or see you later to someone who's blind, well, there's no offense taken in that. You don't have to be embarrassed about using those kinds of expressions. And then the last thing that I would want to point out is that we really don't want to treat people with disabilities as if they're superhuman, or as if they're helpless victims. So if someone, maybe a student, is getting their associate degree in computer science, well, to go on and on as if that was really brave or courageous or something like that, really is implying then that person is unusual, that someone who has a great achievement with disabilities is unusual. You don't want to portray that person as being superhuman, but you don't want to act as if people with disabilities are helpless or tragic victims as well. So the language you use, people just want to be mainstream. And so we want to make sure that our language is also accurate and non-judgmental. It was a long answer, I know, but there's a lot to it because, again, language has power.
And I'm not done with you yet. I want to do a follow-up on that.
Okay.
So let's talk specifically about deaf people, or yeah. So let's talk about how we communicate, right? So if someone has an interpreter, what's the best way to communicate with that person?
And I'm really glad you asked that too, because again, I think sometimes the discomfort in interacting with people is we don't know what to do. So you would always want to talk to the person, not to the interpreter. The interpreter is just a tool. So if I am having a conversation with someone who is deaf, I'm going to be looking that deaf person in the eye. Oftentimes what will happen is we will position the interpreter next to the speaking person. And so that way the deaf person can be looking back and forth between the speaker and the interpreter, reading the body language of the speaker, because much of the context is going to come from body language as well. So you want to make sure as you're speaking, you're showing respect and you're looking at the deaf person, not at the interpreter. And any conversation you have is going to be with the deaf person. You're not going to say to the interpreter, tell him this or ask him that. You're going to speak right to that deaf person. And you can see where that would be showing respect.
And how do you get their attention if they're not looking at you?
So you could do a couple of things. You could wave maybe in their field of vision to capture their attention. You could tap a shoulder, and that would be a polite way to capture their attention, because sometimes they're not going to know you're speaking, and you could go into a whole conversation and realize, no, they didn't catch what you were saying. So just some type of catching their attention by waving your hand or tapping their shoulder would be the perfect way to do that.
And, Jamie, you want to add something?
No, I was just going to add that Pat, you're spot on. And I just would say that people that I've worked with who are deaf are not at all surprised when you tap them on the shoulder or when you wave at them. They're appreciative of that.
And another thing, Denisha, that I found is sometimes we would have someone who's deaf just walk in up to the receptionist desk. And then all of a sudden the receptionist would just panic. What am I supposed to do? And we had a couple of folks on campus who spoke sign language. And so they would try to run and get the people who knew sign. And, really all you have to do, pull out a sheet of paper and a pencil and you're good. It's not that difficult. Or if you're sitting at your desk, and you have the multi monitors, just type to each other. It's not that difficult and no need to panic.
All right, let's go into the next question. And I want to talk specifically about service animals now, Jamie. How do I know if a dog is a service animal? How can I tell? And what's the basic etiquette to use with service animals?
Yeah, so I think I'll start just kind of by defining what a service animal is. Service animals are typically dogs. Miniature horses occasionally are trained as service animals, but typically what we see are dogs. And they are trained to provide a service or perform a task for a person with a disability. So there really is a multitude of tasks that they could be providing. They might lead someone who is low vision or blind. They might retrieve items for a person with a mobility impairment. They might even enter a room prior to their handler to ensure that it's safe. But as I said, there are various and a variety of tasks that they might be providing. The key is that they actually are performing a task or providing a service to that individual. They aren't required to wear a vest. We see that often, but that's not a requirement. and they don't have to be registered necessarily through the disability service office or through, really, there's no documentation that needs to be provided, just as a wheelchair user wouldn't need to provide documentation of the need to use their wheelchair, right? When you do encounter a service dog, there are a couple of things, a couple of questions that you can ask that are appropriate. The first one being, is your dog working? And then to follow that up, you can certainly ask what task that animal is performing for you. And if the person, the handler or the person using that dog indicates that they are indeed providing a service or performing a task for them, then we should at that point consider that animal to be a service dog. When it comes to etiquette, I would say that's a two-way street. We both, the handler and us on the other side of that, have responsibilities and certain things that we should and shouldn't do. The dog, of course, should be quiet, obedient. It shouldn't be disruptive to others around. And then when it comes to our side of things, you know, if you're like me, I'm a dog lover, right? So I see a dog and I want to run up and I want to pet that dog, or I want to greet that dog. But with a service dog, it's really important that you don't do that. You know, just they're dogs. They are highly trained, but we have to remember that they are indeed animals, and they can be distracted, and that can be really disruptive and even dangerous to their handler. So I think it's just really important to remember that we keep our distance and that we certainly would get permission from the handler before we would greet or touch the dog in any way.
Should we even ask that question? I mean, should we even ask, hey, can I pet your service animal?
I mean, I think I would say, in my opinion, probably not, but I think it might depend on your relationship with that person. For instance, you know, I have someone who I know quite well who has a service animal, and he is aware that I'm a dog lover. So occasionally if I see him out in the community, you know, we'll go around somewhere and he'll maybe take the dog off the leash and indicate to the dog that it's playtime now. So it's okay for me to do that. But if he's in a working setting, it's not appropriate at that point. Best to answer the question, I would say.
No, yeah, I agree with that. Just trying to think, as we're talking about service animals, let's just talk specifically about people who are blind or have low vision. What are some tools or some tips that we can think of when interacting with people who are blind or people who have low vision? Should we just, you know, as we're Hoosiers, right? We have Hoosier hospitality. We want to help everybody. Should I just grab, you know, my friend's arm and help her, guide her to where we're going, or?
Well, my first thing that comes to mind is that when you're working with someone who is blind, I think it's really important that you introduce yourself so they know who's in their presence. The sound of my voice may be familiar to me, but it may not be familiar to that person. So anytime I'm working with a student who's low vision or blind, if I see them in the hallway, I always, you know, say who I am before I greet them, just so that they're aware of that. And then, yeah, I think, you know, when you're working with a student in that situation, or a person in that situation, I would ask permission before I would help them with a door or, you know, taking their arm and helping to guide them. I would talk to them about that before I did it, but I think it's certainly appropriate to do that. I know I've spent a lot of time walking around buildings on campus, showing blind students or helping them find where certain areas are. And that's one thing that's really common that I do, is just hold on to their arm and help guide them around until they learn their way.
And I've often found that people who are blind prefer to take your arm rather than you take their arm. And so again, that's just where you would want to show respect and just ask, how can I best help you? Or did you need help?
And asking, again, feeling comfortable asking what their preference is. Mm-hmm. It's okay to do that. And again, I think that's something that people are appreciative of, just like you and I are appreciative when people ask what our preference is about certain things. So.
Denisha, before we go any farther, I just glanced at the chat and noticed there's a lot of conversation going on. I had a poor choice of words when I referred to interpreters as tools, and I certainly didn't mean to reduce the function of an interpreter because they are trained professionals. They certainly are not objects. They are not tools. That was really a poor choice of word. Facilitator maybe might be a better way to refer to the role of an interpreter, a sign language interpreter. I certainly don't want to diminish the role of an interpreter at all. So poor choice of words on my part, which goes back to what I was saying earlier. Words are powerful. Language is a powerful tool, and so we need to be careful the way we use it. So I apologize. I certainly apologize if I offended anyone by referring to an interpreter as a tool.
I think, Pat, I would just say I can understand why you use that terminology. We doing what we do, we've spent a lot of time in professional development conferences and learning and studying about these things, and it has been sort of drilled into our minds that anytime you're working with someone who's using an interpreter, that you're working with that person, you're not working with the interpreter. So that, I know that's where you were coming from with that.
It's the same with, thinking about someone who has a wheelchair, right? We see the wheelchair as the instrument, as the tool, the same way we see the service animal as the instrument or the tool, and that spreads to also the interpreter. So we're all on this continuum of learning and thinking about ways in which we can be more effective in our communication. So, Pat, you just did what we're supposed to do in those instances, right? We're all going to fumble. We're all going to say things that we might not wish to say or, intend to offend. But being able to come back and clear the air and, change what you're saying. That's all that's all we need to do. We have a question from the group chat and it's along the same lines of communication. So how should we respond to analogies to disabilities such as a lame excuse or the blind leading the blind? The analogies do not directly address people with disabilities, but they refer to it. Should we rephrase what another person said minus a disability reference, or should we directly confront the speaker?
Do you want to answer that, Pat, or do you want me to?
I don't know that I know the answer.
I don't know that I do either. I think it depends on the situation you're in. Yeah. I mean, I think you just have to gauge, I see things, for instance, on social media where people use terminology that's really uncomfortable for me and that I don't like, or that I think, oh, you shouldn't say that. In that setting, I just kind of zip it and don't say anything. But if I'm talking with someone over lunch or someone I feel comfortable with, I would certainly address it. But again, I think it just depends on the situation that you're in. And maybe, maybe talking with someone in private, just helping them to understand what's acceptable and what's not, would be the direction to go with something like that.
And some things would not be offensive, just like I was saying a moment ago about saying, see you later to someone who's blind. Well, it's just an expression. Then there are some that are more derogatory in nature. And so of course you wouldn't want to use it, but I couldn't speak for persons with disabilities of how they might feel, and everyone's going to be a little different and how something might affect them. So it's just what you're saying a minute ago, Denisha. We're all learning, and I think the best part about having these conversations that we're having here today is just trying to be sensitive to how somebody else might experience what we're saying. And then when we mess up, then just coming back and saying, I'm so sorry. I certainly didn't mean it that way. And now that I know better, I'm going to do better.
All right, I'm going to go back to a question for Jamie. So let's talk specifically about our students. What do I do if I suspect a student may have a disability?
I think that's a really good question. I think that happens often for our faculty and our staff that are working with students. And for the most part, I think we do a really great job at Ivy Tech of sharing about disability support services and how students can access those services. As you all know, especially if you're faculty, it's included in each syllabus that a student receives. But we all know they don't always read all of that information. Or sometimes they just aren't comfortable reaching out to disability support services right at the beginning. Many students come in thinking, oh, I'm going to have a fresh start and I really don't want to be involved in getting accommodations. I just want to do it on my own this time. I hear that often. But usually by the time they wind up with disability services, they're glad that they did. So yeah, I think it's important that you're able to have conversations with students and help get them the resources that they need. You know, one thing you could do, kind of a less direct way, would be to maybe share a list of campus resources with students that included disability support, or with a student that you see struggling. And then if you want to be a little more direct, I think, you know, it's definitely, I would say, not okay to just straight out ask a student if they have a disability, but rather maybe having a conversation with them privately, just say, you know, I notice you're struggling in this course or in this subject. What are some strategies that you've used in the past, or what kind of things did you do in high school to help you get through this type of material? And a lot of times that will prompt them to say, oh, well, I had accommodations in high school, or I had a resource teacher that helped me with my work, or I had extra time on my tests. And so that sort of opens the door for you at that point to refer them to disability support services.
All right, and we have another question. We have seen unusual and distracting support/comfort animals in a one-on-one student-staff situation. Example is an iguana whose behavior was distracting. Are there many situations that are, for lack of better description, pushing the accommodations envelope?
Sure, absolutely there are. This can get to be a really long subject. I think we talk about this all the time, but there is a big difference between service animals and emotional support animals. As I mentioned earlier, service animals are animals that are performing a task, right? An emotional support animal is an animal maybe that just makes me feel better, or it makes me feel more comfortable in certain situations. Those are two very, very different things. I think that, you know, what I always try to go back to is that, are they performing a task? If they are performing a task, they're a service animal. If they are not performing a task, they are not. So that's a completely different situation that would involve, with our policy at Ivy Tech, you know, for an ESA, we would ask a student for documentation that they needed to have that animal.
And if not, then we don't have to allow that animal.
Correct.
All right. Let's see. My best friend was born with cerebral palsy and has over our lifetimes brought many things out to me that I would have never thought about. And I've been astounded at how some people react to her when there have been challenges she has overcome. For example, if she fell when we were in college, I was not to try to help her up until she asked me to do so. I actually had to hold my hands together to keep myself from trying to help for a while.
Yeah. And again, that's where you're going to take your cue from that person and show respect by asking, is there anything that you would like for me to do? And if they say no, then respect that. And so some of the kinds of over helpful ways that I've seen people do are, if you see somebody in a wheelchair, just take them and start pushing them somewhere. Can you imagine how horrifying that must feel, to be in a wheelchair and then just have somebody take you and start pushing you around? It's total loss of control and dignity. So we always want to ask. And sometimes it's uncomfortable.
I agree. We've talked about students, and I want to kind of change the pace and talk about our employees, right? We're all employees for the most part, the folks that are on this call, employees of Ivy Tech. And this conversation just shows why we need more diverse and inclusive spaces. People with disabilities are extremely hesitant to disclose to their employer, especially those who have disabilities that are not apparent or those that have stigmas associated. So having HIV, AIDS, or a psychiatric disability, folks are hesitant to disclose that to their employer. The individual might be afraid of being treated differently by their coworkers, by being retaliated against by their employer, having their accommodation denied, or any other negative effects. And this all stems from really their past experiences. That's going to dictate how they'll handle their accommodations. Additionally, coworker views of the need and the fairness of the accommodation plays a role in whether the accommodation is granted to, if we're talking about accommodations in the workplace. The bottom line is, when we're not thinking about the person first, we can be creating a hostile work environment. We could be creating a culture where inclusion is not celebrated. We could be potentially losing great, loyal, awesome employees if we don't take this seriously. And I was looking at a study, let me see, Accenture, in partnership with the American Association of People with Disabilities in Disability Indiana in 2018, they released a study called Getting to Equal, the Disability Inclusion Advantage. And this report revealed that companies that embrace best practices for employing and supporting people with disabilities in their workforce consistently outperform their peers, including having on average 28% higher revenue, double the net income, and 30% higher economic profit margins. I know this is all not about money and all of that, but it shows you when we have an inclusive environment that there's a business case for that, right? There is more ingenuity, innovation, creativity in our employment. So I just wanted to bring that up as well. When we're thinking about disabilities and we're thinking about our students, we also should be thinking about our employees and how do we ensure that Ivy Tech is a place where folks feel that they belong, right? With diversity, equity, and belonging. How are we ensuring that Ivy Tech is a place for belonging? I want to open it up now. We have some time left for questions from the audience. And I'm going to do kind of what I did last time. If you have a question you want to get on the mic, go to the participants screen and either type yes, or you can push yes or raise your hand, and I'll unmute you if you'd like to speak. All right, we got our first, Jody.
Good morning, or afternoon, actually. I get this question a lot, and I stumble when answering it. So sometimes faculty want to know if a student has an accommodation in their class, and this has come up with multiple accommodations, and another student says, why do they get to do this and I don't? How can they handle that without revealing information?
I think that this brings up the perfect opportunity to talk about privacy. Mm-hmm. Because students, well, everyone with a disability has a legal right to confidentiality, to privacy. It's no one's business. So, in fact, we have to guard that carefully. So you would never want to discuss any student's accommodations or their disability in front of the class or in front of other students. You would always want to make sure to have any conversation with that person privately. But then your question does come up quite frequently. What do I tell the rest of the class, or what do I tell other students? Really, it's none of their business. So you wouldn't probably phrase it that way, but you would want to explain to them that there are reasons, and that's between the student and me. And that's all you need to tell them. We don't have to. In fact, students don't even have to tell you what their disability is. Faculty know what the accommodations are, but they don't know what the disability is, and it's really not anyone else's need to know of why that student gets that accommodation.
And I think just what you said at the beginning, Pat, just being from the very beginning, just trying to protect that privacy and confidentiality might help you avoid some of those questions. I know sometimes, there are circumstances that happen and it's out of your control, but just being extra cautious and extra careful and trying to protect that privacy might, cut down on some of those types of questions if we can just keep others from even noticing that another student has an accommodation.
Sure.
All right, Helen, you have a
Thank you.
question?
I had something in the chat earlier. First of all, I wanted to say thank you for Patricia for clarifying, but I wanted to explain some of my background with this. My father had Lou Gehrig's disease, and it's a degenerative disease where he went from being fully bodied to being mentally and physically incapacitated. And in his anger over his condition, he began treating his family and other people like tools, where we're supposed to be there to do what he said when he ordered it. We could be belittled, we could be mocked in public or in private. And I felt like, I understand that you have anger and you have your issues, but that doesn't make us any less human, and it doesn't make our feelings any less important. I also felt like whenever I would complain about it, people would just say, well, you just have to understand that he has this. And I thought, is there a separate set of rules for sick people or for disabled people? I certainly agree with all things that level the playing field, but I think they owe the same respect to other people that we all owe to one another.
I appreciate you sharing your perspective, because that's a perfect example of why we have to be sensitive to one another. Words that are going to trigger you and be really hurtful to you maybe would never faze me at all. And so whether we're anything in diversity, inclusion, belonging, I just think it's important to always show respect, to listen, pay attention to what matters to the other person, and I guess work through when we make a mistake, because I'm making them. I still do.
Sure, we all do. John, you want to?
Thank you. My question is more basic, I guess. On the rare occasion that I have positions open within the college, I always try to strive to cast as wide a net as possible to find qualified folks. But I, off and on, again, I think about this, and I confess I haven't done a good job of asking for help. But is there a good resource to share vacancy notices with, or an agency or organization that we could potentially attract folks for employment that would enhance our surroundings?
Great question.
I know vocational rehabilitation, which is a federally funded but state administered program. They do work with employers to try to place different clients that have come through their organization. So that might be an option, but I don't know, that sounds like more of an HR director kind of question, because I don't know that I could really offer any suggestions for that.
I know of there's a job fair every year for people with disabilities that I've seen, and I can't think of the name of it off the top of my head, John, but if I see that again, I could share that with you. And also there's a website, the Job Accommodation Network, I think is a really good resource for folks who are either seeking employment or employers who are looking to hire. So that might be an option for you too.
Perfect.
And,
Jean.
and a couple people are putting things in the chat as well,
Yes,
John,
it's
to
vendor.
assist.
Rhonda.
Vendor consultant. Yep. Yep. That's the one. Perfect. Thank you, Rhonda.
I know this is kind of just out of left field, but I do want to at least discuss it a little bit. We are now in a virtual hybrid world. We really don't know yet exactly how things are going to be shaken out when it comes to coming back to school, being on campus, being virtual. What are you guys seeing, or what are your thoughts? What do you think is to come as we think about our students with disabilities, as we think about ensuring equity for those students when we come back to class in the fall? I'm putting you guys on the spot on this one.
Well, I know that there are a lot of technology issues we've been working through. For example, I've got a couple of students now that are taking exams that they cannot use their screen reading software. Read and Write isn't working with it, which is screen reading software that we offer for our students. So I would say some of the things that we need to keep in mind from every position is that as we are creating materials for our class, as we are putting information in Ivy Learn, as we are putting information on our website, we just always need to keep in mind that there are going to be people who need to access that information that may have visual or hearing or learning disabilities. So will this work with their software? Will they be able to access it? And just always keep that in mind. And then as we're purchasing software, as we're purchasing textbooks, as we're whatever it is, even at the higher levels, keep in mind, are these vendors making their materials accessible? We've got some, for example, we have some third-party testing sites within McGraw-Hill right now. Their materials are not accessible. And so we're having to work through those issues. So those are the kinds of things we just always need to keep that in mind. Is this material going to be accessible? And ask that question from the vendor. What kinds of accessibility features are you offering?
Thank you. Jamie, you want to add anything to that?
I think that's probably honestly exactly what I would have said. Just, asking those kinds of questions from vendors before you're purchasing things. Yeah, I would just echo what Pat said.
And to add on to that, for example, Prezi, that is not accessible. Who would have thought, right? It's a pretty common software that, wow, you can create some great presentations with that until you have a deaf student in your class. And there's no way to caption it. And so we had to get really creative to figure out how to retrofit a whole semester's worth of presentations that were created and used for an online class, and they were not accessible. So it's starting out, if you can just keep those things in mind to begin with, is this going to be, am I using a format, a platform that is accessible to begin with? And then how do I make sure that it's going to be accessible? Consult with the Disability Services Office on your campus. Consult with us. That's what we're here for. We're not the police. We're here to help facilitate accessibility, and we're here to consult.
Awesome. Someone just put something in the chat about webaim.org. It's their favorite web accessibility resource. Many simple things that you can do in Canvas to make courses more accessible. All right. Well, this is the end of our session today, attendees. If you would like to submit any additional questions, comments, concerns, or feedback, please email us at diversity@ivytech.edu. We value everyone's opinion, and your feedback will help us as we determine our next steps in programming. So next week, Tuesday, July 28th, we will be discussing gender pronouns. Gender pronouns are third-person pronouns that we use in the English language that identify a person or something a person possesses, like he, him, his, they, them, theirs, she, her, hers, etc. There are many people who use pronouns other than those that they were assigned at birth, such as transgender, gender nonconforming, and non-binary people. Using the right gender pronouns is a great and easy way to show each other respect, value, and a sense of belonging. Additionally, faculty members can establish a respectful and inclusive learning environment within a classroom setting through role modeling appropriate pronoun usage. Let students know that their creation of an inclusive and respectful learning environment includes referring to others by their pronouns and names. So I'm excited for next week's discussion. Again, these recordings are on our diversity website and also on YouTube for your viewing pleasure at another time. Thank you all and have a great rest of your week.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.